It is the night of October 6, 1943, off the coast of Kyushu. A Japanese convoy, 30 cargo ships heavy with coal and rice, hugs the shoreline so tightly that fishermen in villages near Kagoshima Bay swear they could hear the groaning of the hulls against the tide. Just beyond the horizon in the black water, mines are being laid by American submarines, silent, invisible, set by the clockwork precision of the U.S. Navy's submarine force. A Red Cross inspector, visiting the port of Moji that same month, wrote in his report, "The harbors appear choked with ships, yet their departure is whispered about like funerals." The Pacific War had become a battle of arithmetic and nerves. Japan could build only so many ships, could import only so much oil, and could risk only so many convoys. But every dawn brought new losses, some recorded, some denied. By the winter of 1944, Japan's merchant fleet, once over 6 million tons, was collapsing under the relentless pressure of submarine wolfpacks, aerial reconnaissance, and a strangling blockade of mines. Why did Japanese convoys cling to the coastline when the open sea offered space to maneuver? Why did minefields, first a distant threat, creep closer each night until they touched the very estuaries where civilians bathed and worked? And what did this silent war, fought in shipping manifests, ration books and wreck reports, mean for the lives of prisoners, workers and soldiers stranded in distant camps, waiting for supplies that would never arrive? This is not only the story of steel hulls and torpedo wakes. It is a story of hunger measured in calories, of factories silenced mid-shift, of church bells ringing in empty towns when news arrived too late. It is a story where the fate of empires hinged on whether a single convoy reached its destination or whether it vanished beneath black waves before dawn. The darkness off Kagoshima Bay on October 6, 1943, was broken only by the pale glow of lanterns lashed to the decks of 30 ships. They moved in file like ghosts, so close to the Japanese coastline that the breakers seemed to brush their flanks. Villagers standing on the pebbled beaches whispered that they could smell the coal in the bunkers and the rice stacked in sacks against the bulkheads. These were not warships, they were lifelines. And yet, every sailor on board knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, American submarines prowled, and that mines were being lowered into the seabed like silent traps. Convoy reports later confirmed the composition: tankers, freighters, and a pair of battered destroyer escorts, all hugging the southern coast. Japanese Naval Command called this shoreline concealment, believing that geography itself, cliffs, inlets, and fishing villages could shield the convoys from detection. But a Red Cross inspector passing through Moji port in October 1943 wrote bluntly, "Harbors seem swollen with vessels, yet departures carry the hush of funerals." The convoys left under cover of night, their survival never assured. Why such risk? Because by late 1943, Japan's war machine was already starving. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, bauxite from Malaya, coal from Korea. Every ton had to reach the home islands, or the factories would grind to silence. The Imperial Japanese Navy calculated that 1.5 million tons of shipping per month was the minimum threshold to sustain industry. In reality, they were losing ships faster than they could be built. That October alone, U.S. submarines accounted for over 220,000 tons of Japanese shipping sunk. The crews knew the odds. On the deck of the freighter Shinyo Maru, a sailor scribbled in his diary that the men ate bowls of millet and radish soup before departure, saving the rice for later. He added, "We move in a line so near the mountains, but they feel no safer than shadows." His words echo the larger paradox. Clinging to the coast reduced the chances of submarine ambush in the open sea, but it exposed convoys to mines laid from the air. Here lies the chilling question. If the coastline was meant to be a shield, why did it so often become a graveyard? The answer was in the very shape of Japan itself. Narrow straits funneled shipping into predictable routes, perfect for mining. When the U.S. Navy began Operation Starvation, aerial mine-laying along those straits, the shoreline strategy unraveled. By the winter of 1944, mines claimed more tonnage than torpedoes. Back on land, the contrast was striking. In the same weeks that Japanese crews rationed millet, American canteens in Pearl Harbor served pork chops, mashed potatoes, and coffee. Newspapers like the Honolulu Advertiser reported on football games and war bond rallies, while Tokyo papers quietly omitted shipping losses from their front pages. The free press in one nation shouted victory. In the other, silence was state policy. At Moji, dock workers worked 16-hour shifts, loading sacks of rice and barrels of oil under dim lamps. A port ledger from October 1943 notes until 400 tons of cargo shifted in a single night, yet not a word survives about which ships arrived at their destinations. Families watched the lantern lights fade into the distance, never knowing whether the convoy would reach safety or vanish beneath waves. By dawn on October 7th, villagers near Kagoshima reported hearing distant concussions at sea. Some swore the vibrations rattled shutters. Nothing official was ever published, but U.S. submarine patrol records list the sinking of 2 freighters in that same corridor. The convoys had gambled on the coastline once again, and once again the sea claimed its toll. So the question lingers. In a war where every calorie, every barrel of oil and every day of factory output mattered, could Japan's strategy of hugging the shore ever truly have saved them? Or did the coastline itself, so familiar, so near, become the narrow stage where an empire's fate slowly collapsed? The harbor at Sasebo Naval Base, December 1943, smelled of tar and salt, a place where warships and convoys shared the same waters. Under the looming hills, destroyers prepared to escort merchantmen southward, their decks lined with depth charge racks like stacked barrels of fear. Naval logs show that on December 14, 1943, 12 freighters departed Sasebo under the watch of 2 aging destroyers and 3 sub-chasers. Their destination, Singapore, the artery for oil and rubber. Japan's command believed in escorts as shields, but by then, even officers knew the odds. Escort ships were underpowered, too few, and stretched across thousands of miles of sea. American submarine crews joked in their patrol reports that Japanese convoys were like sheep guarded by tired dogs. A lieutenant aboard USS Seahorse later recalled how sonar pings were frantic but inaccurate, like someone knocking on doors with no idea who is inside. The weakness was structural. Japan had begun the war with barely 20 destroyers available for convoy escort, and most were quickly diverted to fleet actions. The result was predictable: a vast merchant fleet sailing under a thin veneer of protection. Mines and torpedoes slipped through gaps with devastating efficiency. In December alone, Japan lost nearly 15% of its tanker tonnage, a statistic buried in internal Navy reports, but glaring in Allied intelligence estimates. Retention hook. Imagine standing on the dockside at Sasebo, watching a convoy steam out at dawn, flags fluttering in the cold winter wind. Behind the songs of farewell, you would hear the rattle of empty oil drums waiting for refills. Did the cheering families know that the ships they waved to had less than a coin flip chance of surviving the voyage? Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy sharpened its knife. In 1944, Admiral Charles Lockwood's submarine force refined coordinated attack groups, wolfpacks, designed to overwhelm convoy escorts. Ships sailing close to shore were no longer hidden. They were predictable. Aerial reconnaissance from B-24 Liberators, flying from the Marianas, photographed their exact routes. The coastline gamble had become an open map for Allied planners. Civilian life reflected the tightening chokehold. Diaries from Nagasaki. Women working in Mitsubishi shipyards mention shifts stretched into the night, sewing canvas covers and welding seams by lantern light. One entry from January 1944 records: rice ration 330 grams. Factory meal, millet porridge, salted radish. We dream of sweet potatoes. Across the Pacific, American women on the production lines of San Diego worked 8-hour shifts, pausing for coffee breaks and listening to swing music on factory radios. The contrast was so sharp it bordered on cruel. Then came the mines. Beginning in March 1945, the Allies launched Operation Starvation, laying over 12,000 mines along Japan's coastlines, particularly in the Shimonoseki Strait and near Sasebo itself. But the seeds were planted earlier. December 1943 saw the first tentative drops of magnetic mines from B-29 prototypes, testing how quickly Japan's straits could be sealed. Dockside rumors spread like wildfire. A ship had struck something invisible. An explosion had torn a freighter in two, and fishermen whispered about death that waited without warning. What kept the convoys moving was desperation, not strategy. The Imperial Navy knew the coastline could not protect them forever, but without oil, without food, without bauxite for aircraft, the Empire had no pulse. Every voyage was a gamble, and every gamble cost lives. By early 1944, Sasebo's once bustling quays grew quieter. Shipyard records show a 30% drop in departures compared to the previous year. Families grew accustomed to seeing fewer ships return than had left. Church bells in small coastal towns tolled for sailors who never returned, while newspapers printed vague phrases like "some losses sustained." Silence was Japan's official escort, the only constant presence from port to grave. The coastline strategy, conceived as camouflage, had revealed itself instead as a narrowing corridor of doom. With every passing month, convoys were funneled into smaller spaces, stalked from beneath and hemmed in from the skies above. By the spring of 1944, Japan's gamble was no longer a strategy. It was simply the last habit of a nation trying not to drown. The ledger books of Japan's shipping ministry told a story more devastating than any headline. On January 5, 1944, a memorandum circulated in Tokyo. The Empire's merchant fleet had fallen below 3.5 million tons of usable shipping, barely half of what it had been at the start of the war. Each column of numbers represented not just steel hulls, but meals, factory shifts, and ammunition rounds that would never arrive. American intelligence read those numbers with satisfaction. Decrypted intercepts from Tokyo station logs reached Washington daily, noting departures and sinkings in precise detail. In one January summary, the U.S. War Department calculated that Japanese industry could not function below 1.5 million tons of shipping. The arithmetic of survival was being solved in advance, and the answer was collapse. For Japanese citizens, the numbers arrived in smaller, more personal form: ration slips. By early 1944, the official rice ration for civilians had dropped to 330 grams per day, often bulked out with millet, barley, or even shredded daikon leaves. A woman in Osaka wrote in her diary, "We boil millet until it bursts, but it has no flavor. Children ask for sugar we cannot give." The caloric shortfall was unmistakable. Average intake fell below 1,100 calories per person, barely enough for laborers who worked 12-hour days in factories. Across the Pacific, the arithmetic ran in the opposite direction. A U.S. Army private at Fort Benning, Georgia, received 3,600 calories daily: meatloaf, buttered bread, mashed potatoes, fruit cocktail. The New York Times ran stories on meatless Tuesdays and victory gardens, yet America's abundance was such that even restrictions felt like variety. Japanese newspapers, heavily censored, rarely mentioned rations at all. When they did, they celebrated healthy austerity, as if millet soup were a patriotic delicacy. Retention hook. How could two nations at war live on such different scales, one measuring calories by the thousands, the other by handfuls of millet? The answer was tonnage. Every lost convoy erased thousands of meals, hundreds of barrels of oil, dozens of factory shifts. Factories bore the brunt. Mitsubishi's Nagoya Aircraft Works recorded a 25% drop in aluminum deliveries by February 1944. Workers stitched together patched uniforms and forged aircraft frames from inferior metals. Even so, production quotas remained, and failure meant penalties. In one plant, women worked by candlelight during blackouts, cutting their fingers on unfinished rivets. Compare this with American factories, where Rosie the Riveter posters encouraged women to weld with modern equipment, safety goggles, and canteens serving hot coffee. The strain reached military garrisons across Asia. Japanese troops in the Philippines reported eating sweet potato vines, while units in New Guinea subsisted on half rations of rice mixed with sawdust flour. A captured letter from a Japanese soldier to his family in Nagano begged for dried persimmons and miso paste, luxuries that would never reach him, lost to the silent war at sea. Meanwhile, convoys were tracked with surgical precision. The Allies knew that every tanker sunk was not only lost fuel but lost flight hours, lost truck convoys, lost artillery barrages. A single tanker carried enough oil to power the Imperial Navy for 3 days of operations. Sink 2 tankers, and an entire fleet sat at anchor impotent. By the spring of 1944, the shipping arithmetic could no longer be hidden. Families in Tokyo stood in rice queues that snaked around blocks, clutching ration tickets as police monitored the lines. In Nagoya, women gathered in church halls to pray for safe harvests, while in Washington, senators debated post-war economic planning with a confidence born from surpluses. Two nations stared at ledgers that told opposite truths, one of exhaustion, the other of abundance, and so the question sharpened. Could Japan's empire, stretched across thousands of miles, survive when every number, tonnage, calories, rations, output, was moving in only one direction? Or was the very math of war already writing the empire's obituary? The journey of every convoy began not with anchors lifted at sea, but with schedules inked on land. In Tokyo's Shimbashi station, clerks in grey uniforms filed shipping manifests beside train timetables, recording the coal and rice that railcars would deliver to ports like Moji and Sasebo. A station log from March 18, 1944, noted precisely 12:04 a.m., 40 cars loaded with Manchurian soybeans bound for Moji. Those beans were intended for both factories and civilian rations, but many never left the harbor. Allied intercept teams in Hawaii, reading Japan's coded signals, already knew where the cargo was headed. The war in the shadows was fought with pens as much as with torpedoes. American analysts in the Navy's OP-20G office matched Japanese shipping codes with aerial reconnaissance. Photographs of freighters tied up at Kobe or Osaka could be cross-referenced with wireless chatter, turning Japan's coastline into an open book. In one decrypted message from April 1944, Tokyo ordered convoy High 45 south to Singapore. Within days, submarine wolf packs lay waiting in the Luzon Strait. By the end of the month, High 45 had lost 5 of its 10 ships. Contrast this with the Allied logistical theatre. At Oakland Army Terminal, Liberty ships departed daily, their holds filled with jeeps, flour, typewriters, and barrels of Coca-Cola. One War Department report in April 1944 noted that the U.S. launched 2 new cargo vessels every 3 days. For Japan, every convoy lost was irreplaceable. For America, every convoy was a new artery. Expanding retention hook. Imagine a single Japanese convoy, 10 ships inching down the Shimonoseki Strait, versus 2 American Liberty ships being launched that same week in California. One side gambled everything on survival. The other multiplied abundance with factory whistles and christening ceremonies. The disparities showed in daily life. Japanese households in Yokohama received ration slips for dried fish once a month if supplies arrived. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Times advertised victory steak specials at local butcher shops, 35 cents a pound. Japanese children carried rice balls wrapped in paper for lunch. American schoolchildren ate sandwiches with peanut butter, jam and fruit from government-subsidized programs. Convoy arithmetic also determined fuel. By mid-1944, Japanese oil imports had shrunk so drastically that naval training exercises were cut in half. The once proud fleet, designed for decisive battle, now sat idle at anchor, its engines silent. Diaries from naval cadets at Etajima recorded frustration. We train with wooden models. We do not hear the sea engines roar anymore. Fuel that once powered warships now rationed heating in Tokyo homes, where families burned charcoal briquettes to ward off the cold. American abundance extended even to leisure. Newspapers in Chicago debated Roosevelt's fourth-term campaign while running advertisements for refrigerators and washing machines, consumer goods still in production during wartime. In contrast, Japanese newspapers avoided mentioning shipping losses, filling pages with exhortations about sacrifice and the emperor's divine mission. A Red Cross delegate in Yokohama observed in June 1944, ordinary citizens speak quietly about hunger, but loudly about duty. The numbers closed in relentlessly. U.S. Navy figures estimate that by July 1944, Japan had lost over 500,000 tons of shipping in a single month. Trains continued to deliver cargo to ports, but the seas beyond had become a graveyard. Station logs remained precise, carloads of soybeans, bauxite, and rice always noted, but more and more the ships listed as destinations were never heard from again, and so the arithmetic narrowed. The empire that had stretched from Manchuria to the Gilberts was now measured in tons, calories, and rations that slipped away faster than they could be counted. Each sinking was not just a tactical loss, but an equation erased. Fewer meals, fewer planes, fewer ships, fewer chances. By the end of 1944, even Tokyo's clerks understood the truth. The train still ran, the manifest still listed cargo, but the final column, delivered, was emptier with each passing week. The Empire's fate was not written in slogans or speeches, but in the quiet ink of ledgers that told a story of subtraction without end. The Luzon Strait, June 10, 1944. Midnight seas stretched black and glassy, but beneath them prowled the most lethal hunters of the Pacific War. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, slipped silently into position against Convoy 91, a Japanese formation of freighters and tankers bound for Manila. Naval records show the convoy's escorts, 2 destroyers and a pair of converted whalers, sweeping their searchlights back and forth. Yet the ocean was too wide, and the hunters too skilled. At 1:27 a.m., Tang fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 struck home. 1 tanker erupted in flames, its cargo of aviation fuel painting the night sky in orange arcs that villagers along the Batan's Islands mistook for dawn. Japanese survivors later recalled clinging to oil-slick planks, watching as their convoy scattered in panic. Within hours, 5 ships were gone. O'Kane's patrol report read clinically, "Engaged convoy confirmed sinkings 27,000 tons. Escorts ineffective." Yet beneath those sterile numbers lay hunger, shortages, and factories that would never see their coal or oil. For Japan, each ship lost meant another subtraction in the arithmetic of survival. For submarine crews, it was confirmation that Wolfpack tactics worked. The Japanese response was frantic, but fractured. In September 1944, Tokyo issued Convoy Directive No. 83, ordering ships to sail in tighter formations with heavier escort screens. But tight formations also made them easier targets for submarine wolfpacks, which now coordinated by radio. O'Kane himself later described these attacks as harpooning whales that swam shoulder to shoulder. Retention hook. Why then did Tokyo cling to convoy tactics that seemed to invite disaster? Because there was no alternative. The Empire's oil came from the Dutch East Indies, its food from Korea and Southeast Asia, its metals from Malaya and China. Without convoys, the home islands starved. With convoys, they still bled, but at least there was a chance. Inside Japan's naval leadership, cracks deepened. Younger officers demanded riskier routes through open waters, while conservatives clung to coastal hugging. Minutes from a naval staff meeting in October 1944 record one vice admiral insisting, "The coastline is our armor." His words sounded hollow even then. Mine strikes in the Shimonoseki Strait had risen to dozens per week, and escorts were running out of depth charges. Meanwhile, submarine crews waged their war in silence. The men of USS Seahorse counted victories not in ships, but in factory shifts denied to Japan. One petty officer scribbled in his journal, "Every tanker we sink keeps planes from flying, ships from sailing, trucks from rolling. It is a war of subtraction, and we hold the chalk." Japanese sailors saw another face of that arithmetic. Survivors of Convoy High 76 struck off Hainan Island, drifted for 3 days before rescue. One recalled in an interview decades later that the sea was littered with rice sacks, bobbing like ghosts, food meant for thousands now dissolving into salt water. What did those men think as they watched meals vanish wave by wave, knowing their families at home queued for millet gruel? The impact was not limited to the battlefield. In Nagoya, children collected pine needles for synthetic fuel while their mothers patched uniforms. Factories rang with the sound of hammering, but shifts were shorter, raw materials thinner. By contrast, in Pittsburgh, steel plants poured molten metal night and day, supplying both tanks and toasters. The war beneath the waves ensured that the gap between the two nations widened with every patrol. By late 1944, submarine warfare had turned from nuisance to strangulation. Convoys that left Singapore with 10 ships often arrived in Japan with 3, sometimes 2. The waters that had once carried empire now carried wreckage, and so the question sharpened in every admiral's mind. Was Japan's navy defending an empire or simply escorting its decline into the depths? The winter of 1944 into 1945 was when Japan's seas themselves seemed to rebel. Submarines had been predators for years, but now the skies joined them. From air bases in the Marianas, B-29 bombers launched the opening phases of what would soon be called Operation Starvation, an aerial mine-laying campaign designed not to sink warships, but to choke Japan's arteries of supply. On March 27, 1945, the first waves of B-29s dropped hundreds of mines into the Shimonoseki Strait. The narrow passage connecting Honshu and Kyushu. Naval logs in Tokyo immediately registered disaster. Within the first week, 11 ships were lost, several more crippled. Fishing villages reported thunderous detonations offshore and debris washing up in bays where children once collected seaweed. A guard at Fukuoka's shoreline scrawled in his notebook, "The water carries death, though we see no enemy." The psychological toll was immense. Convoys had long feared submarines, predators that could be spotted, hunted, perhaps evaded. But mines were different. They were invisible, indifferent, and permanent. Crews whispered that the coastline itself had turned traitor. Retention hook. Imagine guiding your ship through home waters, only to fear that every ripple, every tide, might conceal the spark that would tear your hull apart. Inside Japan's naval leadership, ideological fractures widened. Hardliners argued for desperate measures, arming civilian trawlers, ordering convoys into narrow coastal lanes no matter the risk. Moderates urged diplomacy, even suggesting exploratory peace talks, recognizing that the Empire's shipping losses were unrecoverable. Meeting minutes from April 1945 reveal an admiral's lament. "Our escorts chase shadows. Our seas are poisoned. The nation cannot endure." But the machinery of total war had no gears for surrender. The convoys kept sailing. At the same time, propaganda insisted on confidence. Radio Tokyo broadcast stirring messages of resilience, even as listeners noticed pauses where shipping news used to be. Newspapers praised unseen victories at sea while omitting the reality. Between April and July 1945, over 85% of Japan's merchant shipping capacity was destroyed. By the summer, even coal shipments from Kyushu to Honshu were imperiled. Ordinary citizens bore witness in ways that statistics could never capture. In Yokosuka, a mother wrote to her husband at the front, "We received sweet potato skins in our ration. The children chew them slowly, pretending it is bread." Across the Pacific, American schoolchildren were buying war bonds with nickels saved from candy allowances. The contrast sharpened with cruel clarity. One nation gnawed at peels, the other funded bombers with spare change. Submarine crews, meanwhile, reported surreal encounters. USS Rabaul intercepted a Japanese convoy of mixed cargo ships and passenger liners. After the torpedoes struck, survivors clung to wreckage while sacks of rice burst open around them, spilling white grains across the waves like ghostly blossoms. A sailor later wrote that it looked like cherry petals on black water. Such images spread among crews, reinforcing the sense that they were dismantling Japan not ship by ship, but meal by meal. By mid-1945, the combined pressure of submarines and mines had achieved what years of battleships and aircraft could not: paralysis. Convoys dwindled to a trickle. Factories closed not for lack of workers, but for lack of fuel and ore. Trains still shuttled goods to the ports, but the ships they were meant for lay rusting at anchor, unable to risk the journey. And yet, the convoys sailed, because they had to. Hardliners could not imagine surrender. Moderates could not enforce it. Japan's leaders stood divided, while the ocean beneath them closed like a fist. So we are left with the haunting question: was this the moment when Japan's war ended? Not with the mushroom clouds of August, but with the silent mines dropped in March, choking an empire before its armies ever laid down their arms. By the spring of 1945, Japan's convoys no longer carried hope but hunger. Ships that once ferried rice, coal, and weapons now limped under constant threat, their holds half empty, their escorts short on fuel. The collapse of supply was not an abstraction. It seeped into every kitchen, every barrack, and every prison camp. For Allied prisoners of war scattered across the empire, in Singapore, Java, the Philippines, and deep in Manchuria, the strangulation of Japanese shipping became both salvation and curse. Rations already meager shrank further. At the Omori camp near Tokyo, one British prisoner recalled being issued a rice ball no larger than a fist, sometimes mixed with millet or barley husks. His diary entry for May 1945 reads, "One portion for the day." High dream of bread. The Japanese guards, themselves gaunt, offered little comfort. Supply convoys had been the lifeline not only for military garrisons, but for the camps they supervised. When the ships burned, so did the food within them. At the Mukden camp in Manchuria, American survivors later described lines of men waiting for watery soup, so thin that a reflection of the sky could be seen in the bowl. Retention hook. Imagine being a prisoner whose survival depends on your enemy's convoys. Each sinking meant fewer supplies for your captors, but also fewer for you. Salvation and starvation arrived in the same torpedo. The Japanese home front fared little better. Urban residents queued for hours for rations that grew smaller with each month. Rice became a memory. Sweet potatoes, millet, and acorns filled the gap. Housewives scoured forests for edible weeds, boiling them into bitter stews. School children were ordered into the fields, instructed to dig up roots that could be ground into flour. And yet, propaganda persisted. Posters showed smiling families with full bowls of rice, even as real families bartered heirlooms for handfuls of barley. A Ministry of Agriculture memo from June 1945, declassified decades later, admitted privately that food reserves are projected for only 3 months. For soldiers on distant outposts, the situation was catastrophic. The once feared Japanese garrisons in places like Rabaul or Truk were reduced to foraging, their convoys cut off by submarines and mines. Marines later described landing on islands littered not with fighting men, but with skeletal defenders too weak to resist. At Rabaul, aerial reconnaissance showed Japanese soldiers fishing with handlines, their uniforms ragged, their weapons rusting in humid storage sheds. The Imperial Navy, once a symbol of pride, now carried humiliation. Convoys that set out from Singapore or Saigon often returned with half their number gone. The remaining ships unloaded pitiful cargoes, barrels of oil half filled with water, sacks of spoiled rice, crates damaged by salt spray. Even these were prized. A port worker in Yokohama, interviewed after the war, recalled women rushing the docks to collect stray grains of rice spilled from broken sacks, scooping them into handkerchiefs before guards pushed them away. In the prison camps, hope flickered faintly with every distant explosion. POWs in the Philippines described hearing naval battles offshore, whispering to one another that the convoys were failing, that liberation might come soon. Yet those whispers were balanced by hollow stomachs. Starvation gnawed quicker than hope could sustain. The Red Cross attempted to intervene, dispatching supply ships marked with the emblem of neutrality. But Japanese authorities often diverted these supplies to their own troops or delayed their distribution until much of it spoiled. A Swiss inspector's report from late 1944 noted bluntly, "The food reaches too few, too late." By mid-1945, the collapse of supply was no longer a military challenge, but a humanitarian catastrophe. Japan's empire had stretched across oceans, but without ships. Its reach recoiled into its own starving islands, and so the question lingered in every camp, every kitchen, every convoy that dared the seas. How much longer could an empire wage war when its people could no longer eat? By the summer of 1945, famine had become Japan's silent enemy. Allied bombs tore apart factories and shipyards, but hunger corroded the nation from within. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, long lines stretched outside ration stations that offered only a handful of sweet potatoes or a cup of millet per family. Children carried small baskets, waiting hours for food that vanished in minutes. Mothers returned home with little more than weeds gathered along riverbanks, boiling them into stews so bitter that even the youngest turned away in tears. Black markets flourished in the shadows of ruined streets. Under bridges in alleys behind burned-out tram stations, rice changed hands like currency. Prices soared beyond comprehension. In Osaka by July 1945, a single show, about 1.8 liters of rice, cost a full month's factory wage. Newspapers, still censored by the government, carried articles declaring food security under firm control. Yet the truth was printed in absence, long blank spaces where editors had been ordered to remove references to hunger. A single surviving diary from a Tokyo school teacher records her students fainting at their desks, one by one, as the lessons of empire gave way to the lessons of starvation. Retention hook. What happens when a nation tells its citizens they are full, even as they collapse in the classroom? In the countryside, desperation bred cruelty and paradox. Farmers still able to grow rice and barley hid their harvests from government requisitions, selling secretly to smugglers who carried food into the cities under cover of night. It was in these moments that the empire cracked from within, not by bombs but by mistrust. Train stations logged fewer shipments of grain to Tokyo, and inspectors noted entire villages that failed to deliver their quotas. Meanwhile, in far-flung garrisons, hunger reached darker depths. At isolated posts in New Guinea and the Philippines, cut off from supply, Japanese troops turned to foraging, then theft, and in some cases to cannibalism. Allied investigators after the war uncovered testimony that by 1945, entire platoons were surviving on roots, rats, and, when nothing else remained, human flesh. Such accounts, though horrific, reflected the total collapse of the supply chain. One Australian report filed in August 1945 noted the capture of a group of Japanese soldiers near WWII who carried cooking pots filled with jungle plants and tree bark. Their rifles long rusted from disuse. Prisoners of war too bore the brunt of famine. At the Omori camp near Tokyo, guards often ate the Red Cross parcels meant for prisoners, claiming transport losses as their excuse. An American survivor later remembered watching his captors chew chocolate bars taken from crates stamped with the ICRC seal, while he and his fellow prisoners were left with watery rice gruel. The cruel irony was that both prisoner and guard were starving. Only the guard had the power to steal. In this climate, women played roles both tragic and resilient. In factories, they operated lathes and assembled munitions, often too weak to stand for long shifts. At home, they scavenged forests for pine needles to brew a bitter tea, or dried acorns to grind into flour. On the black market, women became brokers, couriers, and smugglers, their small baskets less likely to draw suspicion from police patrols. A former Yokohama resident recalled his mother selling her wedding kimono for a few handfuls of beans, a trade that kept their family alive one more week. Religious institutions offered moments of solace, but even they could not escape hunger. In Kyoto, temples opened their gates to distribute soup made of wild greens and lotus roots. At one church in Nagasaki, a priest noted in his ledger that attendance had doubled, not from faith alone, but because the bowl is warm. By July, famine was everywhere. Farmers feared the soldiers who came to seize their crops. City dwellers feared the bombs that burned their homes, and prisoners feared the bowls that came empty. Hunger had become the common language of war, and it raised a question more devastating than any bomb. How could Japan fight for an empire abroad when it was starving at home? In the final weeks of August 1945, the seas around Japan fell strangely silent. For years, the empire's survival had depended on convoys that crept along coastlines and darted through minefields, but now the last ships were gone. What few vessels remained were too battered, too fuel-starved, too exposed to risk the journey. The convoy system that once stretched from Singapore to Saigon, from Rabaul to Yokohama, had collapsed into scattered wrecks resting on the ocean floor. At Sasebo Naval Base, once a hub of imperial power, port records from late July list only a handful of departures. Small coal barges, trawlers and fishing vessels pressed into military service. The mighty tankers and freighters had been lost to submarines and mines. Sailors stood idle on the docks, watching the horizon, knowing no relief would come. One Japanese officer, in a rare surviving note, wrote, "The sea is empty. The empire has become an island again. Retention hook. How does an empire accustomed to expansion react when the ocean that once carried its ambitions now starves it into surrender?" In Tokyo, the absence of convoys was measured in hunger and silence. Radio broadcasts that once announced shipping arrivals went quiet. Housewives who once listened for word of rice shipments from Formosa or coal from Korea now heard only air raid warnings and proclamations of spiritual resolve. The truth was in the markets. Prices soared beyond reach, and rations dwindled to almost nothing. In Shibuya, a shop ledger dated August 8, 1945, shows the sale of only 2 items, pickled radish and a small bundle of seaweed. That was all the shop had left. For prisoners of war, the collapse of the convoys meant both despair and hope. At camps near Osaka and Nagoya, Allied POWs whispered that the Japanese could no longer feed themselves, let alone their captives. Yet hunger still gnawed. A British corporal later testified that in the last weeks before liberation, his camp's rations had fallen to a single rice ball per day, supplemented by thin miso soup if they were fortunate. And still they waited, For food, for liberation, for the sound of aircraft that would mean the war was ending. Meanwhile, on the docks of Moji, Red Cross inspectors found warehouses nearly empty. What little remained, crates of dried fish, sacks of millet, was guarded as fiercely as weapons. One inspector's July report noted, with chilling brevity, "Reserves in Kyushu insufficient for 1 month." The collapse reached the front lines in grotesque form. In Luzon and Borneo, stranded Japanese garrisons received no relief. American patrols advancing inland found men who had not seen a supply ship in months. Their uniforms were in tatters, their boots replaced with woven grass sandals. Some carried rifles without ammunition, others surrendered without a fight. For these men, the Empire had abandoned them to starvation. And then, in mid-August, the news spread like a whisper across camps, cities, and ports. The Emperor would speak. On August 15, 1945, civilians huddled around radios, straining to hear Hirohito's voice through static. In one Tokyo neighborhood, survivors later recalled gathering in silence, understanding only fragments. Endure the unendurable. Bear the unbearable. There was no mention of convoys, no mention of hunger, but everyone listening knew that food, as much as bombs, had brought the Empire to its knees. For prisoners, liberation came in a rush of disbelief. American B-29s that once rained fire now dropped food parcels, cans of Spam, cartons of cigarettes, chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil. At Omori, men scrambled across the yard to catch them, holding up tins to the sunlight like treasures. A U.S. Navy report from September logged the scene in clinical terms. Average weight gain of 10 pounds per man within 2 weeks of liberation. In those final days, the absence of convoys defined everything. The hunger in the barracks, the silence of the docks, the surrender broadcast across the Empire. The Empire that had tried to rule the seas had been undone by the sea itself. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the war did not end with a clean break. It dissolved slowly like smoke drifting across ruined cities. For Japanese civilians and Allied prisoners alike, the first taste of peace was not triumph but hunger, still gnawing from within. Yet amid the wreckage, ships once again began to move, not war convoys but vessels of repatriation and relief. From September onward, Allied authorities organized vast operations to return prisoners of war. At ports like Yokohama, Manila, and Rangoon, hospital ships flew the Red Cross flag as stretchers carried emaciated men aboard. U.S. Navy records list more than 132,000 Allied POWs liberated across Asia in the weeks following surrender. Each man carried not only scars, but stories of hunger, forced labor, and endurance. At Camp Omori outside Tokyo, American prisoners who had once fought over scraps now lined up for orderly medical inspection. Doctors measured them carefully, noting weight gains with each passing week. An Army report from October 1945 observed, average caloric intake increased from 900 to 3,200 per day within 1 month of liberation. Such numbers were not abstract. They were the difference between life and death. Retention hook. How does a man who once starved on millet and weeds adjust when handed a plate of Spam, bread and butter? For many, the shock of abundance was as disorienting as the famine that preceded it. For Japanese civilians, liberation brought both relief and reckoning. American occupation authorities, under General Douglas MacArthur, coordinated emergency shipments of grain and powdered milk. By December, U.S. records show 240,000 tons of food arriving in Japan. Yet hunger lingered through 1946, with black markets still thriving in alleyways and under train arches. School children, who had once fainted at their desks, now received small lunches of bread and soup, part of a program funded in part by U.S. aid and later by the Marshall Plan's broader reconstruction framework. Women played a central role in this fragile recovery. Factories retooled from munitions to textiles, and women filled the looms. In rural villages, they organized cooperatives to share tools and seeds. Diaries from the era record women carrying U.S. flour sacks on their backs, their old silk kimonos patched with American cloth. Survival had always depended on them. Rebuilding would too. The paradox of race, so stark in wartime, also lingered into peace. Black American soldiers, who had guarded prisoners and distributed food, now walked Japanese streets as representatives of a democratic power that still segregated them at home. Japanese civilians, many meeting African Americans for the first time, recorded mixed impressions, surprise, curiosity, and sometimes warmth, noting that these soldiers often shared rations with hungry children. In these fleeting acts, the contradictions of freedom and prejudice intersected on Japan's shattered boulevards. Religion and community also began to heal the wounds of war. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines reopened not as instruments of nationalism, but as centers for mourning and remembrance. In Nagasaki, where the cathedral lay in ruins, priests held mass in open air, distributing bread donated by American chaplains. These were small gestures, yet they gave shape to a society learning to endure without empire. The legacy of hunger became a lesson etched into Japan's post-war identity. Schools taught children not only history but nutrition, emphasizing balanced meals and the dangers of scarcity. Vocational programs trained thousands of young men and women. Statistics show over 120,000 enrollments by 1948, ensuring that recovery meant not only eating but working. By the dawn of the 1950s, the famine years had become a memory, yet the discipline they imposed remained. Newspapers, once censored, now freely debated policy. Citizens voted in new democratic institutions, and in every home the clatter of rice bowls was accompanied by a silent vow. Never again would hunger be the measure of Japan's fate. The convoys that had once carried war now carried wheat, cotton, and machines. The empire that had starved itself on ambition was gone. In its place rose a nation that would rebuild not through conquest, but through resilience, democracy, and trade. And so, from the silence of empty seas to the noise of bustling docks, Japan's story turned. Hunger had ended an empire. Food, in time, would help build a democracy.